Hey everyone, welcome in to Patterns Tell Stories. I'm your host Klaus, and today we're going to be talking about the concept of free will. With me today, as always, is my co-host Garrett. How's it going, man?
Awesome, dude. How are you doing?
A little shaken up from this past week. Well, I guess it was yesterday. We had a bit of an earthquake in New Jersey. I'm about 10 miles away from the epicenter of that earthquake. I was just sitting here at my desk doing my normal 9 to 5 job, getting ready for a meeting, and then all of a sudden, I don't know. I felt like I was going crazy for about 5 seconds. And then, it was just the whole apartment started shaking for a good 30 seconds. And my wife woke up and dogs started freaking out. And we just had no idea what to do. So we just ran downstairs, and all of our neighbors in our apartment building just freaking out too and sprinting outside. And I don't know. It was pretty wild. I've never experienced anything like that. It was pretty intense to just feel sort of the power of the earth, just in that way. It really kind of gave me a new appreciation for just how insignificant we are just as individual humans when something that massive and that powerful can just completely shake up everything. It was pretty wild and just something I hadn't experienced before, and hopefully don't have to experience much more in the future, but who knows what's going on.
I'm glad you're okay, man.
Yeah, me too. I guess it was like a 4.8 magnitude earthquake. And there were a couple aftershocks too. There was one last night. And now my HVAC system, when it kicks on, has me jumping out of my skin. So that's fun too. But so
that's a hell of a way to wake up too.
Oh yeah, dude.
Like that feeling when you feel like you're falling, except you're literally, the earth is shaking.
It's interesting. Someone was saying that the earthquakes on the West Coast and the East Coast are a little different because I guess this person experienced both. They said on the West Coast, they're more like a wavy feeling. And on the East Coast, it's more like a jolting, shaking feeling as opposed to wavy feeling. So I don't know. I found that interesting, and definitely it was pretty jolting, I guess, or jarring. My coworker was working from home, essentially right above the epicenter, and his monitors fell over, and his kids freaked out. They were like crying. He was in the middle of the meeting, but that was our first earthquake experience, and it's fun. But not much this week as far as news is concerned, from what I can tell. Unless you got anything.
I've been reading a lot this week. I don't know if I would say it's reading. Do you consider listening to audiobooks reading?
Yeah.
Then I was reading a lot, because I keep finding audiobooks on Spotify, and they had Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth on Spotify. That one is a really good counter to people who think that life was intelligently designed. One of my favorite arguments in that book is about what's called the recurrent laryngeal nerve. And it's this nerve that runs all the way down your neck. Well, at least in mammals, it runs down your neck and it like loops around your heart and then goes back up to your brain. It's like a very inefficient way for a nerve to work. The most efficient way, if an engineer were to design it, it would just be from point A to point B, but it takes like this abnormally long detour. And the reason for this is because when our great times 1,000 million fucking grandparents were fish, the recurrent laryngeal nerve is from point A to point B. And it's very simple. But as we developed this neck, slowly became what we are now, we see that the recurrent laryngeal nerve takes this particular path. So it shows that like we have evolved over time. Well, Dawkins was interested, and they let him sit in and participate in a draft dissection for this giraffe who had passed away at a zoo. They had an opportunity for this team of biologists to come and study and dissect this giraffe. And they exposed the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Dawkins follows it all the way down its neck. And it's like an unintelligently designed part of an animal. That's the corny thing I was listening to today.
So it's not too efficient, I suppose.
Yeah, it's just an inefficient way of being designed.
Got it.
Especially from the standpoint of an engineer. A great engineer would never make that path, especially for the function a nerve serves. And then the other example he gave, or one of the other examples he gave, was the vas deferens. I don't know if you know what that is.
Yeah, that's like a dick nerve, right?
That's a it's a sperm duct but these sperm ducts like loop around in our pelvis in a very unique way that is like pretty inefficient. Yeah, just little things like that.
But for some reason is advantageous, right? Or not.
Let me use this example. So an eyeball, our eyeball, even a mammal's eyeball or a bird's eyeball, something that's out of the water. Our eye had to develop very slowly but surely in the process of natural selection. That starts with just like very simple, as simple as possible, like the ability to detect light and dark. So let's say a creature has that ability, like they finally get that sense. Well, that the group of the offspring that are able to detect light are going to have a better chance at survival because they're not going to be eaten or they're not going to be consumed, or they're going to have a better chance at being able to evade whatever's there to knock them out of the gene pool. So you have a better chance at survival if you can determine light dark. Well, let's say very slowly but surely that develops one step further into a pinhole, and things that can see through a pinhole are going to have a better chance at survival. Well, then that pinhole grows a little bit. And before you know it, you're going to have an entire lens that is giving you high definition input into your brain. And you're able to render light and dark. You're able to determine how fast things are moving. You're able to determine how quickly you have to move away from an animal before they get to you. All these different things start developing. Well, when we started going out of the water, our eyes were very inefficient and our eyesight was very bad. It just so happened that the mammal eye had to evolve twice. And we developed high definition in the water. And then once our ancestors got out of the water, they had pretty shitty vision. And then they had to develop a new lens over their eye that is going to like refract light in a different way that's going to be more efficient. And now we have the eyes that we have today, which are like very good in terms of what we can detect and what we can render. But even still, we are very limited into the amount of electromagnetic light that we can detect with our eyes. Like all we can see is that Roy G. Biv spectrum. Our nervous system has only equipped us so well to observe the world. And even though it takes like millions and millions of years, by these like simple processes, we overcome things that maybe aren't doing us very many favors, like having poor eyesight. We can overcome that, but it just takes millions and millions of years, and natural selection burns off the dead wood in a way.
It kind of makes me wonder how Donald Hoffman's theory applies to that, where he talks about senses and perception are sort of a user interface. He essentially thinks that, our perceptions are there to guide adaptive behavior. How he thinks about it is he says that the truth is too complicated of our reality, that we're given a sort of user interface, like a filter, I guess, that same idea of a filter in our brains. So our conscious reality is a user interface to allow us to procreate and keep on evolving. That's natural selection, right? Evolution by natural selection. Everything we see is to fulfill adaptive behavior. So it's basically like if you were trying to fiddle around with, the electrical wires on the motherboard to try to send an email, that wouldn't really work out well. You have a user interface to do that. So what we see in our perceptions is that user interface as opposed to the ins and outs of the machine. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
There's stuff outside of that filter, outside of our user interface, that is still part of the computer, i.e. part of our reality. You can drag and drop something into your trash bin on your desktop. You don't have to go messing around with the RAM or the motherboard or anything like that to do it. You're given a point A to point B, easy way. And he says that we are given that because that's what makes it easiest to guiding adaptive behavior.
That sounds really similar to how Jacques Vallée, have you seen his theory of everything else speech?
I believe so, but I do not remember it.
It's a great speech, so I recommend people listen to it for themselves. But one of the parts of it is he's comparing our brains and how we store information and just how we interpret our world to a computer. At first, he compares it to a library. And he was like, well, in a library, you have a certain amount of shelves. And once you fill up the shelves, then you're pretty much hard pressed to store more information. And he was saying that a computer is much different. The way a computer stores information this is the way we should be thinking about the informational nature of our universe. I don't know if people realize this, but he was one of the people who helped create the ARPANET, which was like a precursor to the internet. By and large, I know he's considered like a astrophysicist, but like he is a computer scientist. He is a trained computer scientist. So that's something that's real fascinating about Jacques Vallée, and something that he brings to the table that I think is very unique that people overlook a lot when they just call him a UFO researcher, is that he brings something to the table that a lot of people are humbled by very quickly, because computer scientists are no slouches.
So we talk about this a lot, and it is mentioned in Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces series. And it's something he mentions about OR, Roger Penrose, and Stuart Hameroff. These are two scientists who have come up with a theory of quantum consciousness, or they hypothesize that consciousness is a quantum process that happens within the microtubules of the brain. So the microtubules determine quantum states, and that is how consciousness manifests. And so Peter Levenda in Sinister Forces, as we talked about before, brings up the fact that Penrose and Hameroff, these two scientists who came up with this OR theory, orchestrated objective reduction, they were invited to a RAND working group that was sponsored by DARPA, which is a high-tech research and development arm of the Pentagon. Levenda says that they were invited to this back in 1998, which I think coincidentally we brought up, which is pretty much right after when the remote viewing programs either ended or went into the black world, which happened around 1995. So the fact that this happened in 1998 was pretty interesting, and sort of intriguing part of this is that this working group was called to sort of imagine what the world would look like, and how government and just society in general would look like alongside giant leaps in technological advancement. So that was the reason for this working group, was essentially, what kind of tech will be there in the future, and how are we going to adapt our laws and politics and just societal structure to deal with these coming advancements in technology. They're basically like, what we have in place is not sufficient enough to keep pace with this. So that was the point of this working group. And so I was finally able to track it down, and we wanted to go over some of this, and at least the Penrose and Hameroff section of it. So like I said, the main part of this was to address issues with governance and government structure in itself. It's kind of weird, because when you read through the main body of this thing, it almost seems like the scientists were brought in for a different reason than the paper. I mean, and then in the appendix, which is where the working group summaries are, that the scientists produced for this working group, those don't really address the governmental part of this either. Yeah, I just wanted to go over part of that. I don't know if you read through this yet or not, but or you had any thoughts on it.
I'm reading the part right now where it's explaining their definition of technology. It says, what is technology? The term technology, when examined critically, is often used to refer to tools with which society or individuals are not yet comfortable. The more complex a machine is, and the more that collective knowledge is needed to sustain it, the more time it takes to assimilate this technology into broad social use. The more technology requires infrastructure, the more likely it is that governance structures will be created to oversee or support the technology. What does this mean for the technologies we examined during our study? In the case of information technology, the extent of social and technical knowledge needed to sustain the information system is large, as is the infrastructure required, but use of the technology is highly individualistic. Government regulation and private sector standardization are highly active in these technology areas, although they have trouble keeping up with the pace of change. The rate of adoption has been relatively quick, perhaps because the skill of communicating does not need to be relearned simply to use the new tools. One could question whether biotechnology should be considered a, quote, technology. It has anomalous features that make it hard to categorize. Recombinant DNA, for example, while resulting from a complex technique, is a simple product. Moreover, it is not a tool but a biological agent. It acts on its own once it is programmed to perform in a certain way. The development of biotechnology products requires extensive social and technical know-how, but does not necessarily require a large infrastructure to be deployed. It is not clear what government regulation is required to support or control biotechnology, or even whether it could be controlled, and it appears that private sector standardization efforts have not yet emerged in any real way. Fetal tissue research, for example, is not allowed to proceed using government funds, but private research groups make their own decisions about its use. The practice of biotechnology falls more nearly into the definition of a technique, the skill for doing something, rather than that of a tool. Tools are used to make biotechnology products, and the outcomes are certainly intended to extend human capacities and make the world more habitable. However, the nature of the product itself and the way it works set it apart from other kinds of technologies.
Specifically for Penrose and Hameroff, the reason they invited them there was to discuss the role of the computer in enhancing concepts of human intelligence. That's what it says in their section there. DARPA and RAND thought that their theory of consciousness was capable of enhancing human cognition, or at least relevant to it, or applicable. So the report goes through their theory, and I think the last two sections of this are probably the most relevant. We talked about previously the recent Tom DeLonge interview on TTS Talks that he did with Jim Semivan, and he talks about how he believes free will might be fundamental to the physics of the universe, right?
Like, we restrict our free will with our own belief systems.
Yeah, exactly.
He gave the example of his own mother, of how she was a real faithful Christian, and even that pulled into her decisions of who she marries, or her day-to-day decision making ultimately boils down to this path she's chosen that we call today a belief system. Right. That's what I got from Tom. And
yes. So that's pretty much it. Yeah. Our belief systems sort of limit our choices into doing what that belief system sort of wants us to do. Don't marry outside of your own faith. Don't, have sex outside of marriage. It sort of keeps you confined throughout generations. You believe what your parents believe, so you pass that on to your children and, that kind of thing. So his idea is that potentially the UFO phenomenon is there to reinforce these belief systems. Yeah, it limits our free will choices, so it's sort of deterministic, but also probabilistic at the same time. Yeah, we talked about that previously, and I thought it was really interesting because in that same interview, Tom is referencing, when he talks about this stuff, he references sinister forces. I mean, obviously, he loves Levenda's work because he asked him to be part of the Secret Machine series. But this is what Tom said in the interview. He says, if you look at Peter Levenda's book, Sinister Forces, what he did, he found all these synchronicities and patterns in real life events over decades, from World War II and the Nazis to Roswell and the JFK assassination. You've got the same people, a lot of the same kind of events happening, and a lot of weird connections to certain groups and secret societies. Weird things where you're kind of going, if someone wanted to engineer life to end up in a certain place, these are the things that did it. Very specific events got us here. And when they're all connected to each other in rather odd ways, then you're kind of going, who set this up? Peter's books, I think, were really genius in that regard. There are all these things that we read in a lot of these different ancient stories, like how the devil can't kill you, but it can deceive you enough to kill yourself and others. There are these weird laws. But then you look at some of these spiritual teachings in other places, these outside forces can't necessarily live in this physical realm, but they can deceive you or be the voice whispering in your ear. In the UFO event stuff, it seems very similar, where you have people who have abductions. Then they're whispering in the abductee's ear about the end of the world or how they need to change their life. Jacques Vallée was like, well, if we can't study when these things show up, maybe we can study the abductee. If you look at the abductee, they're starting cults, they're killing themselves, or they're changing their life, leaving their wife, leaving their jobs, and starting a religion or something. He goes, that's weird. It's like they're being deceived, and then they make free will choices to end up at a certain place. So that's kind of Tom's idea, is that, all these events are sort of synchronous, and they happen at certain times to lead us all to a certain endpoint. And I think it's interesting that in that same book, Sinister Forces, that Tom references, Levenda references this exact working group study And this is what it says about free will in this study. This is Penrose and Hameroff. They say quantum computation with objective reduction may be associated with cognitive activities. While classical neural level computation can provide a partial explanation, the ORC-OR model allows for far greater information capacity and addresses issues of conscious experience, binding, and non-computability consistent with free will. Such functions as face recognition and volitional choice may require a series of conscious events arriving at intermediate solutions. Pre-conscious processing of information occurs in the form of qubits, or superposed states of microtubule automata. As the threshold for objective reduction is reached, these qubits collapse to definite states and become bits, resulting in a conscious experience of recognition or choice. The problem in understanding free will is that human actions seem neither totally deterministic nor random. In ORC-OR, reduction outcomes involve a factor that is, quote, non-computable. The microtubule quantum superposition evolves linearly, analogous to a quantum computer, but is influenced at the instant of collapse by hidden non-local variables, in parentheses, quantum mathematical logic inherent in fundamental space-time geometry. The possible outcomes are limited, or probabilities are set by neurobiological feedback. The precise outcome, our chosen action, is determined by effects of the hidden logic on the quantum system poised at the edge of objective reduction. This could explain why people generally do things in an orderly, deterministic fashion, but occasionally their actions or thoughts are surprising, even to themselves. So this is very similar to what Tom is stating, what he's talking about. Things are guided, right? There is free will, but it's limited by these probabilities. That's pretty much exactly what Penrose and Hameroff are saying here. So obviously, I believe that had some sort of impact on what Tom was talking about in that interview and just how he sees the UFO phenomenon as a neurobiological feedback. And this is just potentially on a social scale. It's macroscopic in the sense that it is, it's just fundamental that these sort of quote unquote sinister forces are part of a feedback loop that keep us on a specific trajectory.
One of the things that I had written down was that weaponizing psychic ability, which is what I gathered was like a big part of what Andrea Puharich was interested in and what like MK Ultra was for. And what I'm sure a lot of current studies today are like geared towards is, and I say weaponizing, but like even remote viewing. I feel like that's something that if we're talking about the military, that's an intelligence gathering tool, right? Like that's something that could be particularly useful, especially if it works the way that these scientists are claiming that it works. That could be an invaluable tool for the military, especially if it's something that you can repeat and something you can train. You know how they talk about like the collapse of the wave function? Something remains like in a wave state until something observes it, and then it becomes like in its now definite state. Is that how you describe it?
The objective reduction part is it's a type of quantum state reduction that happens spontaneously when a quantum system reaches a certain level of superposition, which means quantum complexity. But unlike the collapse of the wave function, like the standard quantum mechanics, what people know to be like you observe something and then that becomes its permanent state. It's caused by, observation or measurement. Objective reduction is different. It's an objective process, not subjective. It's objective that occurs due to gravitational effects on the quantum state, as opposed to it collapsing when it's measured. And then, the orchestrated part of it, it means that these events are, orchestrated by the brain's biological processes.
What were you saying about pain? Or I don't know if you were using pain as the particular example.
I was talking about the user interface and our sensory inputs are tailored to keeping us reproducing and becoming more efficient, I guess. I guess pain would be a part of that.
Oh, sure. In animals that feel pain, that's a huge indication that they have like a way more sophisticated nervous system, because there's a lot of animals that it appears that they don't feel pain at all. because everything has an evolutionary cost. I know you could think like, oh, well, what advantage does pain give you? Well, pain, if something's unpleasant and your body makes you feel pain,
You avoid it.
You're going to avoid whatever that is. And then maybe the animals that feel the most pain are going to have a higher chance at survival in a given group. But let's say that you're an ancestor of any given animal, let's say of even a human, and you're not yet developed like sophisticated neural network. If you don't feel pain or anything yet, there's a chance that and then there's also a chance that when you have these random mutations, many mutations, if not most mutations, are not advantageous. Like it's very rare to have a mutation go your way to where it actually helps you get selected. Usually a mutation occurs and it's not something that's particularly advantageous, but occasionally you get one that is advantageous. So like I was saying, everything has an evolutionary cost, including pain. So some animals, instead of incurring that evolutionary cost, they just develop like a freeze sense, or not a freeze sense, but that's their response to whatever stimuli excites them, is they just freeze their bodies.
Like a possum.
And that costs much less energy for their bodies, instead of developing this sophisticated neural network that we have.
That's their user interface, their specific path brought that mutation into play for them, because that's what let them reproduce more efficiently, I guess.
I had 2 books pulled up. Well, actually 3. And I kind of wanted to talk about all of these if you're down to have a long conversation. But one of them was Andrija Puharich, when we're talking about free will. If you're familiar with his interest in what he called the 9.
Yeah, sinister forces. So
sure, exactly. And the messages that he was purportedly getting through channeling sessions from these 9 entities, or from Uri Geller, who was channeling this entity called Huva. So Andrija Puharich wrote a book called Uri, A Journal of the Mystery of Uri Geller. And in this book, there's a lot of very bizarre, fascinating things in this book. And I do not believe these things are necessarily true before anyone wants to jump my shit and say that I believe this, or this is just what this very bizarre army doctor believed and wrote in his own book. And this guy, for those who don't know, from 1953 to 1955, Andrija Puharich served as a captain in the Army Medical Corps. In Annie Jacobson's book, Phenomena, she explains that Puharich kickstarted hallucinogenic mushroom drug research for CIA in 1954 under MK Ultra Subproject 58. A lot of people recognize Andrija Puharich because of his research on this Brazilian healer named Arrigo. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he was known as the surgeon with the rusty knife. And there's a real controversial book, I think it's written by John Fuller, about this Brazilian surgeon. I don't even know if I should call him a surgeon.
A butcher.
Yeah, fucking people would come to this guy's house and he would excise cysts and cataracts. And there's videos on YouTube of Andrija Puharich filming Arrigo while he's working on people. But this isn't the point. And then Andrija Puharich also famously is the American researcher who brought Uri Geller to the United States to be tested under laboratory conditions by the scientists Hal Puthoff and Russell Tarr at Stanford Research Institute in the early 70s. And this was also at the behest of Edgar Mitchell, who we've talked about plenty of times on this show. But one of the ways they convinced Uri Geller to come to the U.S. to be tested was Puharich had his friend, Dr. Mitchell, contact Geller and kind of persuade him using his celebrity as a famous astronaut. So the 9, arguably the strangest activity Puharich participated in was on June 27th, 1953, when he gathered some of the most notable families in America to his farmhouse in Maine for a seance with a Hindu scholar named Dr. Vinod. There were members of the DuPont, Astor, and Forbes family present at this seance, among others, totaling 9 people. Arthur Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, was also one of the attendees. Essentially, Vinod began to channel some force and told the group that they had made contact with the Nine. The Nine claimed through Vinod that 9 extraterrestrials, or 9 principles and forces, were now in contact with them. The Nine would eventually say that they were extraterrestrial beings living on a large invisible spacecraft hovering over the planet. According to Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces, Book 1, The Nine, Vinod went into a trance promptly at 12:15 a.m., and then R, one of the extraterrestrial 9, began speaking through him at 12:30 a.m. Threads appeared out of nowhere on the floor in front of Vinod, and he passed one to each of the human 9, telling them, "Tonight we want to create Brahmins in this world," and that the thread was a sign of their initiation. Puharich was very intrigued by this interaction and subsequently spent years trying to find mediums who could contact the 9. In the 1974 book, Uri, a journal of the mystery of Uri Geller, Puharich catalogs meeting Geller in 1971 and being astounded by his abilities. According to the story, Geller was able to channel the entire 9 himself. As it was explained in the book, the 9 were not the only entities that were available for Uri to talk to. Puharich claims to have channeled different sources through Geller by hypnotizing him. So that was a little bio of Puharich that I wrote in my Substack post, Metallic Voices. And people who are interested in that particular seance with Puharich should definitely check out Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces Book 1, where it's literally called The Nine.
Bizarre. And, it's so weird.
It's really bizarre. So anyways, one of these channeling sessions that Andrea Puharich had with Uri Geller is channeling this entity he called Huva. So this is like a weird part that I think it's overlooked in these books. So this is what it says in The Stargate Conspiracy by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. When Puharich returned to the United States in February 1972, determined to have Geller's wild talents evaluated scientifically, he contacted SRI International. Significantly, although SRI Supremos Targ and Pudov were in charge of the testing, the key figure in this scenario was former lunar astronaut Edgar Mitchell, the, quote, funding and contracting agent. Significantly, the Geller experiments at SRI coincided exactly with the first CIA involvement with psychic experiments there, specifically their sponsorship of research into Ingo Swann's extraordinary talent for remote viewing. And in Uri Geller, they had the golden child of the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad. Is it too unlikely that Geller also was being investigated by the CIA? Geller has gone on record as admitting he worked for them. And, as we shall see, Puharich himself was on their payroll, at least from time to time. In an interview in 1996, Geller made the telling comment, and probably, I believe, the whole thing with Andrea was financed by the American Defense Department, end quote. When Geller arrived in the United States in August 1972, the 9 recommenced their antics with more messages on instantly wired tapes and teleportations. Significantly, Geller himself was not a convert to the 9, even at this stage. He found their pranks childish and ultimately unimpressive. He was to say of them in August 1972, quote, "I think somebody is playing games with us. Perhaps they are a civilization of clowns," end quote. At the time that Geller began his SRI tests in November 1972, the 9, through their representative spectra in those early days, started to describe their plans for an imminent mass landing of spaceships, claiming that Puharich and Geller's roles were to prepare mankind for this momentous event. They then began to talk about another extraterrestrial race, called, somewhat unfortunately, Huva, who had come to Earth 20,000 years ago, specifically to the area now called Israel, where they had encountered Abraham, claiming that this meeting was the origin of the biblical story of the latter joining heaven and earth. On 27th February 1973, Puharich took Geller to meet Arthur M. Young at his house in Philadelphia, thus completing a circle that had begun 20 years before with the channeling of Dr. Vinod. Sadly, there are no accessible records of what happened at this channeling. So that's a little background for what Huva and exactly like there's a lot more information about Puharich and Geller out there that's accessible for people to read. And I highly encourage people to do their own research and read about this themselves. But this is Puharich and Uri Geller talking. Uri Geller is channeling Huva, and Puharich is asking him questions. This is in Puharich's book, Uri, A Journal of the Mystery of Uri Geller. And they're bringing up a whole bunch of shit, religion and aliens. And then they get into the topic of free will. And I thought that would be real interesting for this conversation. It says, Andrea Puharich, what is the history of Huva in the evolution of the human race on this earth? Uri, we first interfered with the human race 20,000 years ago. We came on a planned mission from our own solar galaxy, and our first landing place on Earth was at the place you were at in Israel, at the Oak of Mamre in Hebron, where Abraham met us. That is the origin of the legend of the ladder to the gods, because they saw us come out of our craft on a ladder device. However, we found traces of the presence of other visitors from other spaces who had been on Earth millions of years earlier, but we found man in much the same animal condition that you see him in today. Puharich, when was the last time you actively tried to upgrade the quality of man's self and of his civilization? Uri, we give advice actually about once every 6,000 years. The last time we did this was 6,000 years ago to the Egyptians. Our advice is usually given gently, and it is not too strong, and we do it more for our own purposes than for man's benefit. Puharich, was this in the period of Imhotep? Uri, yes. He was a man very much like Uri, and he brought to the Egyptians all of their civilization. Puharich, was this the period of Tahuti also? Uri, yes. He was better known for his powers of healing. Puharich, were there others? Uri, yes. Were there other places where you tried to help man by stimulating the process of civilization? Uri, yes. 6,000 years ago, we tried to help in other places. The area that you now call Alaska, this culture passed on to what you call China. We also did this in India. Puharich, now that I understand the pattern, I can fill in the details from archaeology, mythology, and history. Uri, this is the time in which humans were allowed to see us physically. They abjectly worshipped us, which we could not tolerate. Puharich, I am deeply concerned about a problem that lies heavily on the mind of every man. Is there a soul? Uri, yes. Did you ever really doubt it? Puharich, no. But I need your view in order to illuminate my opinion. What is the nature of the soul? Uri, it inhabits different worlds at different times in its existence. When the physical body dies, it goes with all of its being to its own world. There it carries on with the next phase of its existence. It may go on to other spaces, or it may even return to an Earth physical body for another round of existence. What humans call reincarnation may occur. There are higher powers that divide these people, souls, and that decide where they shall go. The purpose of all existence is to move toward God. However, no one can know God. We ourselves can only know God by reaching him as an idea, not physically. Puharich, how does the soul relate to you? Uri, we occupy our physical bodies for about 1 million years at a time. However, our computers do not have souls and they do not die. We too, as souls, move on toward God. Everything that exists moves. Puharich, what is the life track of a human soul like? Uri, the soul goes through at least 100,000 life tracks as it climbs up toward God. There is no way to tell you about time. You see, you can never understand the vastness of time, and there is no end to time. Puharich, may I repeat? Can you reach God? Uri, yes, with ideas, but not physically. We die, for we last in our physical bodies about 1 million years of your time. Puharich, well, speaking relatively, is our human life short or long? Uri, only powers higher than us can answer all these questions of mortality. Some questions for humans, and even us, are totally unexplainable. There is a vastness to the universe that never ends. Puharich, once I asked you in Israel for the definition of a light age. You didn't answer. Can you answer now? Uri, yes. It is 100,000 million Earth years. Puhark, you do mean Earth years, not light years. Uri, yes, Earth years. Puhark, in the total time track of the human race, all past, present, and all of its future yet to come, where are we now? Are we along at 10%, 50%, 90%? Where? Uri, we know the past of the human race, but this is one of the secrets. We cannot tell it to you. As to the future, we are not permitted either. But remember, all that people need to do, God has written on stone the 10 Commandments. Thus shall it be done. Remember, you are working for us in ways that are important to us, in which we have not yet explained. Actually, there's no special message for you to pass to the human race. It is possible that there should be a war impending, as between Russia and China, there may be a message to prevent it. But you may try to open their minds with things like telepathy and psychokinesis, things which we have almost forgotten. Yes, they are to be helped. Puhark, if your secrecy is related to the principle of non-violation of free will in humans, why is there to be some revelation now? Uri, our secrecy has only to do in very small part with the free will of humans. Mostly it is because we don't want to reveal our intentions. In the past, we have even landed before masses of people, but we cannot afford anymore to land visibly on your planet. It is because of your tendency to panic, to worship, to react abnormally to us. Puhark, during the past quarter of a century, there have been many space visitations reported. Are these yours? Uri, most of these reports by humans are due to hallucinations and aberrations, but some of our units have landed. Most of the reported landings have been from other visitors from space, some of whom we do not see, but which you can see. They are of different vibrations, different spaces, different velocities. We are the only ones who are mostly here. The other visitors come and go. We stay. This tape will vanish when you hear it. Farewell. Puhark says, my prime concern in writing this book has been to alert the world to this historic series of events and not so much to describe their minutiae. These details can be filled in later if the reception of this work warrants it. It is obvious that I am personally convinced that superior beings from other spaces and other times have initiated a renewed dialogue with humanity, but it is equally obvious that my case for this conviction can be carried into the heart of every person, largely by the sense of truth my words carry, and not on the basis of objective proof. It is my hope that as Uri continues his research efforts at the hands of science, and as he carries personal testimony to people, the truth of what he and I say will take hold. And of course, it is up to the 9 and their various controllers and messengers to decide who shall be witness to their presence. Much of this kind of revelation in the future will undoubtedly appear from day to day in news reports, television reports, and other media. This will consist largely about other people's experience with the kind of things herein reported, as more and more sightings occur in the coming years. It is only when a large number of other people experience to some degree what Uri and I experience that our credibility will be enhanced. I want to make it clear that I have, as of this writing, never met a being from the 9, Spectra, UVA, Rhombus 4D, or others of this genre in a face-to-face sense. My meetings have been only through the message systems I have described. Furthermore, I have not been inside one of their craft. While I do not doubt that superior beings exist out there, I do not know what they look like, how they live, or even what their goals are with respect to humankind. Considering that I have had 2 years of intermittent experience, I am remarkably ignorant about these beings. On the other hand, I have complete faith in their wisdom and benevolent intentions towards man and living things on Earth. My lack of hard knowledge about them is the kind of deficiency that does not erode my faith in their essential pursuit of the good, the true, the beautiful, and the just.
Yeah, that's wild, man.
Yeah, I don't know if I even want to include that, dude. It's talking about fucking Israel. And
no, I'll probably edit it, but
okay.
I'm gonna blow your mind right now.
Oh shit.
So, staying in that same vein of souls and the 9. So there was a story told by Admiral William McRaven. I don't know if you've heard this before.
Isn't he the creator of SEAL Team 6? Actually, I think Richard Barcinko is the creator of SEAL Team 6.
McRaven was SEAL Team 6. And I think he got like let go because he was too like he was too by the book.
But he led the team that caught Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, he was a Navy SEAL. He was a Navy SEAL who was essentially credited with, killing Osama bin Laden back in, I believe, 2011. He's sort of like a national hero in a lot of people's eyes. Probably not so much the conspiracy theorists, but that's sort of besides the point. So McRaven wrote a book called Sea Stories, which was obviously about his time in the Navy and the Navy SEALs to the extent he could tell them. He wrote down several stories in this book. And one of them he talked about on a podcast recently, at least within the past few years. I found that story really interesting. So I went and actually got the book where he writes it down. It's pretty wild, and kind of the synchronicities with what you just read are really sort of intense. Yeah, essentially the story is that he and his team went to recover a Navy P-2V aircraft that had crashed or was lost since 1948 after persistent appeals from the relatives of deceased crew members. His team got a letter from Vice President George H.W. Bush at the time, which he put in his book, and I'll just read the letter real quick so you know what they were tasked to do straight from the Vice President. The President of the United States requests your assistance in locating a Navy P-2V2 reconnaissance plane lost in British Columbia, Canada in 1948. The plane departed Whidbey Island Naval Air Station on November 4th, 1948 for a routine patrol and was never heard from again. A Navy search and rescue crew located pieces of the wreckage in 1962, but owing to the hazardous conditions were unable to recover much. For the next 27 years, the plane remained lost. Recently, a Bush pilot flying in the region of Tofino, British Columbia, spotted a shiny metal object inside an extinct volcanic crater near Mount Gwyneth. The base of the crater is filled with water, and it is possible that the remains of the aircraft lie deep beneath this mountain lake. On board the plane were 9 souls, and it is our duty to locate them and return their remains to a proper resting place. So they got this letter from George H.W. Bush, and they were tasked with basically seeing if they could find this plane that this Bush pilot had said that they had seen during a flyover. So the families of this crew that died in 1948, this was in September 1989 that they were tasked to do this. So this was decades after. I guess there was a lead. So George H.W. Bush told the families that, he would have McRaven's team go look for this plane. The suspected position was in a high altitude region. They wanted to conduct high altitude diving operations at the crash site. It was about 10,000 feet above sea level. And so they ventured in the secluded area. It was only accessible at specific times due to, how bad the weather was. And there were a bunch of logistical challenges, apparently, and they had to jump out of the helicopter as it was hovering because they couldn't land. And eventually they found the plane. It was in a ice cave. There wasn't much left of it because of the weather conditions. And I guess they found a few bones of the people who had crashed there. So they told the families of the victims of the plane crash, the more adventurous relatives of those families came, and they held a kind of memorial service, right? So during this small memorial service, this is what Admiral McRaven says in his book. I'm just going to read it real quick because this is coming straight from the guy who basically coordinated the mission that killed Osama bin Laden. So he says, later that day, we assembled all the family members and held a small memorial service near our campsite. Half of the bone fragments were buried under a makeshift cross. The other half, we would return to Arlington and provide full military honors to our fallen. As we gathered around the cross, it occurred to me that this would be the final time any man would venture to this location. Most of the crew who perished that night had families, children who grew up strong in their absence, but who would never know their fathers except by some old black and white photos. We bowed our heads and I prayed. For a brief moment, tears flowed and heads remained bowed. I glanced up from the gravesite to see Barker staring off into the distance. His head was cocked hard to the right and his mouth was open. Beside him, Ellis was wide-eyed and quietly pointing something out to Carter. Turning around, I looked in the direction of the ice floe, and there, high above the peak, a lone bright object sparkled in the sky. It looks like a signal flare, Swentek offered. It did look like a signal flare, I thought, In fact, it looked like a military-style parachute flare, bright white, almost silver, suspended in the air, possibly caught in an updraft off the side of the mountain. Suddenly, another flare lit the sky, and another and another and another. As we watched in silence, the entire ridgeline filled with glowing white orbs that hovered just above the mountaintop. "Boss," Walker stammered, "how many flares do you see up there?" I began to count, but I knew the answer even before I finished. "There are 9 of them," Carter said. The orbs hovered for more than 15 minutes, and then suddenly, one by one, they all rocketed skyward and were gone. In silence, we packed up the remainder of our gear and shuttled the family members back to Tofino. And as the sun began to set over the mountaintop, I boarded the helo for one of the last rides out. As I adjusted the headset, the pilot came up on comms. "You guys are the talk of Tofino, Commander. People have been searching for that plane for years. Now that the lost souls have found their way to heaven, maybe our luck will change." I adjusted the volume on my headset and unconsciously leaned over to look the pilot in the eye. "What did you say?" The pilot grinned. "My ancestors believe that the remains of the dead must be visible to heaven so their souls can be guided through the Great Dome." Checking his compass setting, he glanced around to make certain we were clear of the mountains. "Legend says that the sky is a great dome, and there is a hole in it through which the spirits pass in order to get to heaven. The spirits who live in heaven light torches to guide them through." The pilot craned his helmeted head in my direction and laughed. "It's just all Indian folklore, but I'm sure some local will buy you boys a beer when you get back to Tofino." Sitting back on the floorboard, I watched as the ice floe disappeared into the distance, the thumping of the rotor blades marking our progress back to Tofino. I looked skyward, smiled, and rendered a salute. The crew was finally home. Isn't that fucking crazy?
Holy shit.
9 orbs just floated in the sky for 15 minutes, then just shot off as they were having this memorial service for the 9 people who had passed away in that plane crash in 1948.
Oof.
Yeah.
Well,
It's a very serious person saying that story. Clearly, this whole crew was there to witness this. So it's sort of a full circle, brings us back to the whole soul idea. And, Tom DeLonge says UFOs are containers for souls. I forget specifically what that tweet was. So Tom DeLonge has a little graphic on his guitar. It has a UFO on it, and it's abducting someone, and it says soul catchers is what it says under a UFO abducting someone. And then I remember he did a tweet, and the tweet was in reply to someone saying, basically suggesting UFOs might only be 10% more advanced than our tech. What he said is, except that they can bend the fabric of space-time, manipulate and control antimatter reactions, contain and transfer the human soul, alter and progress the human genome, and timeshare our consciousness. Must be like 3 years ahead of us. He was just joking. But in that tweet, he says contain and transfer the human soul. So that comes back to what Tom says about that too, is that these things are interested in our souls. That McChrystal story really ties into that. And it's funny because, there were 9 of them. Just a bit of a synchronicity.
Yeah, dude, that's a wicked story. I didn't know that. I knew that he went on Jocko Willink and told a story about
That's
UFOs.
The story, yeah.
But I didn't realize that was the entire context of it.
Yeah.
That's heavy.
Because I had watched that and I wasn't going to just read what he said on the podcast. So I was like, let me go find the book. And it took me like an hour. It's definitely worth reading, I think. But I mean, that's he's being straight up. He sticks by that
What
story.
year was this? You said this was 1989, a year into H.W. Bush?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, the chapter's called The Ghosts of Tofino, Coronado, California, 1989.
It's crazy, too, all these stories of people looking for aircraft. Like Kenneth Arnold was a story looking for aircraft. Jimmy Carter tells a story about the remote viewers finding a downed plane. Because a plane crash, especially one where there's deaths, which is fucking most of them, because plane crashes are terrifying, that's an inherently high emotion event. I always wonder if events like that are easier for these remote viewers to sense because of the amount of care. I don't know. That sounds kind of corny and woo.
I mean, dude, this story was woo as fuck. This really just made me think of what Tom's been talking about. The soul container, the soul catcher. It's freaky. The fact that the guy who masterminded killing Osama bin Laden, we'll talk about 9 orbs floating in the air for 15 minutes during a memorial service for these crew members. The same number of orbs matching the number of crew members on this flight and then just shooting off into the sky. So pretty wild. Yeah, I think that's good for this week. You got anything you want to plug? I'm pretty good. I mean, I don't know. I kind of quit Twitter again. So check out, I guess, Threads or I don't know. We still have the podcast Twitter account up. So we'll be dropping this on there and any announcements will be on there. That's all I really got. Join our Patreon if you want to come on the Discord and hang out. I'll be there a lot more now. And you got anything?
I'm looking forward to fucking this next week.
Oh yeah, that's gonna be fun. We're actually meeting up for the first time, so that should be cool. Klaus and Garrett in the city. It's a documentary, not really. No, it'll be cool. It'll be great to finally fucking chill.
Hell yeah.
But yeah, that should be it for this week, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.